Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this presentation is on the defeat of Germany, the end 1943 to 1945. So, after the failure of the original German offensive into Russia, and to obviously the other countries that will ultimately become part of the Soviet Empire, the Ukraine and Belarus and so forth, which began, of course, with Operation Barbarossa in June 22nd, 1941. And you can get a good look here on this map of the shape that original offensive took. You had the three major frontal assaults, the southern one heading towards Kiev, the center to Smolensk, and ultimately to Moscow, and then, of course, the northern one to Leningrad, also today referred to as St. Petersburg. After the German offensive is stopped in the winter of 1941 and 1942, the Germans were stopped, surrounded. They encircled St. Petersburg or Leningrad, and Leningrad was barbarically besieged. The offensive also was stopped just a few miles outside of Moscow. And of course, the Germans were absolutely entrapped by a very harsh Russian winter. A winter in which, in some cases, it got so cold that the fuel inside their tanks froze. After this winter, Hitler, for a brief moment, thinks that he has made a decision that would prevent the ultimate German defeat. And this involved his launching of a southern offensive in September of 1942 towards the south, and particularly towards the area around Stalingrad. Hitler's goal is not simply to take the city of Stalingrad. In a lot of respects, Stalingrad almost became a diverted obsession of Hitler. Instead, the goal that Hitler was planning here was to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus region to the south of Stalingrad. There's huge oil fields here, and Hitler thought that if he could seize these, one it would help the German war machine with needed resources, as the demands of the war were becoming increasingly huge, and two, it would prevent these from falling into the hand or being used by the Russians. During the course of this operation, the Germans will ultimately seize the city of Stalingrad, and Hitler will demand that the city be taken and controlled. He will, time and time again during this phase of the conflict, refuse to allow his military forces to strategically retreat. And this was a devastating mistake by Hitler and for his armies. Stalingrad was to a large degree a diversion away from the primary and most significant goal, which were the Caucasus oil fields. And the Nazis the German army could have seized those oil fields and controlled them without obsessing over Stalingrad. But Hitler was very much becomes obsessed with the city of Stalingrad. He refuses to allow his troops to retreat when they had a window to retreat. And Stalingrad ultimately, after the Nazis take it, will be seized and encircled by Russian forces. And it will turn into the most brutal battle of the entire war in all likelihood. So the Battle of Stalingrad lasted from August 1942 to February of 1943. The battle is ultimately remembered as perhaps the most destructive battle in all of human history. Well over 1 million casualties from this battle. This battle was part of a German effort to launch an offensive into the southeastern Europe, through the Ukraine, into the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the area of the Caucasus, where they hoped they could seize the huge oil supplies in this region, thereby denying the Soviets of these resources for their army, as well as giving it to their own army. And they hoped that this could be the sort of big offensive that could bring the defeat of the Soviet Union. It was a gamble. The Nazis can only attack on one front. So if you remember the original invasion on June 22nd, 1941, you had three major columns: one towards St. Petersburg, the other towards Smolensk, and the other towards Kiev in the Ukraine. Now, in this case, you have one column, and that's a gamble. You expose a huge area of your flank. You run the risk of cutting your supply lines to your troops, but it was a huge risk, and they hoped that they could do this through blitzkrieg very quickly and obtain a very quick seizure of this area. They were unable to repeat these successes from 1942, and ultimately Hitler will be drawn into a battle for Stalingrad, the city, and Stalingrad was really an unnecessary target. It becomes the focal point of these entire campaigns, the significance of taking this city. But in truth, the city itself was not integral to the overall offensive to seize the Caucasus, and very much became a sort of almost like a diversion that Hitler obsessed with taking. The city began with a besiege of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe excessively bombed the city, indiscriminately targeting the urban area of the city. The Nazis then enter the city, and you have close quarters urban warfare. Eventually, the Nazis will push, the Germans will push the Soviets back to the edge of the Volga River. And it is here that the Soviets will finally launch a counterattack in which they cut the German lines on the outside of the city, and they encircle the city. After the encirclement, the German high command, the German military leadership, insisted that they should conduct a breakout operation in which the army would basically launch a retreat offensive in which they would break out through one point of the Soviet lines surrounding the city and begin a coordinated retreat from the area to prevent the loss of their entire 6th Army unit. Of course, Hitler refuses to do this. He insists that they will not surrender, that they will hold the city. Even though, again, the city itself was not imperative to the grand goal, which was to seize the Caucasus oil fields. The result of this ultimately is the city is surrounded, and the German 6th Army is ultimately going to have to surrender in February of 1943 due to a lack of ammunition, to a lack of food, and so forth. The total casualties from the battle are over 1 million, and it's a massive strategic and psychological defeat for the Germans. The Germans in the battle had suffered a strategic defeat because they had lost the 6th Army, and it was a crushing psychological defeat because of the scale of this setback to the German goal. And it was clear that at this time, now it was clear that the blitzkrieg strategy of trying to defeat the Soviet Union relatively quickly and take them out of this war was not going to happen. It was clear now that Germany was descending into a reality of total warfare, and that any hope of defeating the Soviets quickly was now completely gone. So it's a strategic and a psychological defeat, and from this point you will see a consistent withdrawal or retreat, slow retreat of Germany as the Soviet Union increasingly gains the upper hand in the war. And of course, this moment really marks the turning point for the German war effort in general as well. You do see other sort of counteroffensives by the Germans after this event. In the summer of 1943, you have the Battle of Kursk, in which the Germans try to launch a counteroffensive against a bulge in the Soviet lines near Kursk. You also have the Battle of the Bulge from the Western Front that I'm sure some of you guys have heard of. But both of those offensives were not these kind of large-scale blitzkrieg offensives that were designed to take another country out of the war quickly. Instead, these offensives were simply strategically designed to halt the enemy's advance. They were really defensive counteroffensives. And so you really see the slow retreat and destruction of Germany following Stalingrad. This battle came at tremendous consequences. The casualties are unthinkable, and it was incredibly destructive not only for the Germans but for the Soviets, who took by far the largest amount of casualties and actually came into the battle. They actually came into the battle relatively unprepared. In fact, there's stories that Nikita Khrushchev told of the battle in which soldiers were sent in to fight with only a magazine and bullets, without a gun itself, because they didn't have enough guns for their soldiers, and they were given the command that when your comrade is killed, you pick up his gun and fight with it. It was a desperate time for the Soviets, as well as ultimately the Germans. If you deserted from the Soviet lines, you would be shot, and so the destruction and just totality of this type of battle, if that makes any sense, is really unthinkable. And it's a crushing defeat for the Nazis, but it came at a tremendous cost to the Soviets, who, in terms of life lost, the Soviets suffer the most in the Second World War. Here is a German soldier after the defeat in Stalingrad, with the Soviet soldier, of course, behind him. The Battle of Stalingrad is really unprecedented in the scale of loss of human lives. Casualty figures are debated just because of the sheer number of people and the difficulty with documenting this. Generally, it's accepted that Soviet casualties are over 1 million, and that German casualties, and their allies, of course, too. You have to remember that Germany has Romanian units, Croatian units, and so forth. Suffered over 800,000 casualties. On the lower left, you see the German dead at Stalingrad, just absolutely littering the ground. And of course, you see a column of POWs, the surviving members of the German 6th Army, being marched to prison camps. The German soldiers over the course of the war would much more eagerly surrender to the British or the Americans than they would to the Soviets. The Soviets were pretty notoriously bad to their POWs, and if you were captured by the Soviets, the likelihood would be that there was a great likelihood that you would never come home ever again. By contrast, the British and the Americans were known to treat their POWs pretty well. Most of the people that you see in this picture here would have gone to prison camps and died in captivity. The vast majority of these individuals would never have come back to Germany again. After Stalingrad, you really see a strong attempt by the Germans to finally mobilize for total war. And of course, these propaganda flyers are demonstrating the militarization of the Hitler Youth. You'll also see much older Germans be called into fight. It is the call for total war. When we say total war, it means full and complete mobilization of the home front. And of course, the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, had already been doing that. But Hitler was, the Germans were organized around that principle of blitzkrieg, of lightning war. And as a result of this, they had never actually mobilized for total war. The home front remained only partially mobilized. And this obviously would be impossible to sustain once it was clearly apparent that this war would not be a war that blitzkrieg would bring to an end quickly, that it would be a long, drawn-out war of attrition. But of course, the mobilization for total war will be far too late to save the Germans from defeat. Here you see on the left, you see the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, on February 18th, 1943, in which he makes the call to the German people for total war. And, of course, the idea is that Germany would now be committed to total war. Goebbels was the minister of propaganda, and so he was the voice of, effectively, the public and ideological voice of Nazi Germany, perhaps more than anybody else. The Battle of Kursk was really the last of the last German offensive attempt, really of the war, but in the Eastern Front. Actually, I suppose you have the Battle of the Bulge. It's later in the Western Front. But in the East, the Battle of Kursk is the last attempt by the Germans to mount an offensive that could possibly stave off the Soviet offensive advance against them. Here you see in this artistic depiction, you see German Tiger tanks engaged at the Battle of Kursk. Kursk becomes associated with some of the largest tank engagements ever, if not the largest tank battle ever. The Nazis were intent on basically seizing a large section of the Soviet armed forces. And this was around the Kursk salient. A salient in military terms refers to a bulge in the opposing forces' lines. And so the Nazis had planned to basically launch two offensives against the flanks of this salient, and to use two large pincer envelopments to seize huge sections of the Soviet army. And Hitler believed that if you did this, it would prevent the Soviets from mustering what was needed to launch the coming offensive that year against them. And so this was, this was an attempt. This was a really last-ditch offensive effort by Hitler. He's motivated to try to stop a coming Soviet offensive. He's motivated to try to shore up the will of his allies, who are considering leaving the war. And so the Germans prepare in advance, and actually their preparations for the offensive were delayed for a period of time because they were waiting on the arrival of a new tank, the German Panther tank. And the Soviets also had received intelligence that suggested that this offensive was coming, and so the Soviets prepared very thoroughly for the offensive maneuvers by the Germans, and ultimately the Blitzkrieg is stopped in its tracks. It's the only time up to this point in the war that an attempt at using the offensive Blitzkrieg strategy failed. It is stopped. And at this point, this is the last great offensive for the Nazis. And at this point, it seems that the situation is increasingly impossible for the Germans to prevent, ultimately being overwhelmed by the Soviet army and the Soviet offensive. This is a map. Obviously, this is a present-day map of this area of the world. So St. Petersburg during World War II would be Leningrad. Of course, Volgograd, which would, today Volgograd is the name of what used to be known as Stalingrad. And you can see Kursk, which is located about 250, 260 miles to the southwest of Moscow, near the border of the country today of Ukraine. The Eastern Front becomes associated, and in a lot of respects, the Second World War particularly in the latter phases, becomes associated with a total war. And in that respect, we see the usage of scorched earth policies. Now, the Russians had used scorched earth policies against the Germans when the Germans invaded. And a scorched earth policy refers to, as you retreat, you destroy everything that the enemy might use. As the Nazis retreated, the Nazis used these types of policies as well. And of course, here's a Russian village in flames. And of course, at the end of the war, Hitler issued an order to destroy all of the German infrastructure when the attack, when the defeat was, absolutely guaranteed, and Germany was being occupied. Hitler issued an order to have the entire infrastructure of the German nation destroyed, to basically conduct a scorched earth policy on Germany itself. And the people who these orders were initiated to actually, in many cases, refused to carry out these orders. So we're going to take a second and look at the Western theater a little bit. The Germans had really known that the Allies would seek to launch an amphibious attack on them at some point, and so they constructed defensive fortifications all along the English Channel and areas of the North Sea, designed to defend against an Allied assault, as would be the case seen during D-Day. The Atlantic Wall, which was most fortified in areas around the Pas-de-Calais and at Normandy, the areas on the English Channel, involved pillbox, machine gun turrets, all kinds of landmines and of obstacles on the beaches that were designed to make an amphibious attack and landing very, very difficult. After the North African campaigns are over, General Erwin Rommel was actually made the head of overseeing these defensive networks. And in the lead up to D-Day, the Allies actually deceived Hitler, and they deceived Hitler by creating a fictitious army group that was located in the southeastern corner of Great Britain. And this was a fake army group. They had tents, they had blow-up tanks and cut-out people on the ground, and they sent false intelligence documents out to be captured so as to trick the Germans into thinking that there was a major army group that was located in this area of England and therefore should be expected to attack at the narrowest point of the channel, which was the Pas-de-Calais. Of course, the D-Day invasion was going to happen at Normandy, and Hitler was largely deceived by those kind of tactics, in the sense of using a fake army group to trick the Nazis into, or the Germans into, moving their troops. The idea that the Allies had in mind here was that if you could get the Germans to think that they were building up for an invasion at Calais, that they would ultimately reposition their armed forces from Normandy to Calais. And Erwin Rommel had basically pleaded with Hitler to not do this, to leave his forces encamped as they were. But kind of at the last second, Hitler, who feared a landing at Calais and getting behind German armed forces, ultimately does redivert German troops over to the Pas-de-Calais and effectively took the bait and fell for the trick. And of course, here we see a section of the Atlantic Wall, German soldiers arming a section of the wall in Belgium and northern France in 1943. This was part of the Western so-called Fortress Europe, as there were these tremendous defensive networks built by the Nazis, and ultimately these would be under the command of Erwin Rommel after the North African campaign. And Hitler was largely deceived, by the way, when it came to the landings of D-Day. Hitler was deceived, and he did not, again, follow the advice of his military command, of figures like Erwin Rommel, who suggested that Hitler should not reorganize his armed forces to protect the narrowest point, the point at the Pas de Calais, which Hitler ultimately does. He was deceived by American and British intelligence trickery that suggested that the amphibious landing would happen at the narrowest point of the English Channel at the Pas de Calais, which of course was not the case. It would come at Normandy. And Hitler, again, he took the bait in that case, and he repositioned troops to that area, thus softening up the Atlantic Wall for its defense against the D-Day invasion. This is a look from a Higgins boat. The Higgins boat were the primary infantry landing unit. These boats were very shallow hulled. They had high sides in them, so when you were inside of this boat, you couldn't see out. It's kind of like floating in on like a giant lunchbox. And then when you got to the point where you were going to, disembark, the door would come down and you would go out into the, into waist-deep water and charge the beaches. Depending on what beach you're landing on, at what time, and what wave, you could face incredible resistance. And there were 5 major beaches: Utah, Omaha, Juneau, Gold, and Sword. The D-Day operation began on June 6, 1944, and was codenamed Operation Overlord. It is the largest military operation in history. It's important to note, too, that because these boats were shallow hulled, it was kind of like a floating lunchbox almost. It would take every single wave, if you know what I mean. And so inside of these boats, oftentimes soldiers, became, woozy, even nauseous before that gate went down. And so it was a very uncomfortable type of way to arrive at the beach, but it was absolutely necessary because of this large-scale amphibious landing. The Higgins boat was absolutely fundamental to making D-Day possible. Here we see Dwight D. Eisenhower addressing Allied troops a day before the D-Day invasion, a day before Operation Overlord. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander of operations. Great generals like British General Montgomery, the United States General Patton, were underneath the command of Eisenhower. And Eisenhower made key decisions about the Allied advance on Germany after the D-Day landings. Eisenhower insisted, once the Allies had gained a foothold on the beaches, Eisenhower insisted that the move towards capturing Berlin, to conquering Germany, should be consistently carried through on 3 major fronts. This was against the opinions of the British leadership, who thought that the United States should launch sort of a one-ditch, like single column, as fast as you can assault towards Berlin. Eisenhower feared that you could outstretch your lines by doing this, and you could potentially become cut off and then surrounded, and it could be disastrous. And so he chose the more conservative option. Eisenhower also, in being the supreme Allied commander, had a tremendous amount of pressure on him. As they prepared for the D-Day operations, Eisenhower was deeply conscious of the thousands and thousands of men that he would send to their demise in these operations. There were issues with weather also before the attack, which delayed the attack, and was also a heightened concern for Eisenhower in getting this to go off as a success. The D-Day invasion involved Allied soldiers from throughout the world, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Greece, from Free France, Britain, Canada, and of course the United States, and others. And he was under a tremendous amount of stress, and it's said that that Eisenhower, who was a cigarette smoker, very much smoked like a chain smoker at this time, and very much obsessed with the tremendous stress. Maybe obsessed is not the right word, but was incredibly weighed down by the tremendous stress of coordinating and directing the largest military operation of all time, but also one that held the ultimate fate of Western Europe and the lives of thousands and thousands of people. There were 5 beaches that were chosen for the D-Day landing. These were Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Sword Beach, and Juno Beach. And these were efforts that were that involved the combined forces of the British, the Americans. There were obviously Canadian units that fought here, Australian units, and so forth that were engaged in the D-Day, the Allied invasion of June 6, 1944. And here you see the beginning of this full-on assault, the largest military operation ever. After the success for the Allies in D-Day, they began the pushback on the German Empire from the West. Likewise, after the highly costly success at Stalingrad and then Kursk, the Soviets pushed the Germans back from the East. It is not to say that after those moments, Kursk, Stalingrad, and D-Day, that everything was easy going. The war was hardly over after the D-Day landing, for example, and it was a huge task that the Allies had to undertake in launching a large 3-frontal assault on Germany. And of course, Germany would launch a last-ditch counteroffensive in the winter of 1944 and 45 in the areas around the Ardennes forest of southern Belgium and Luxembourg. In Germany, there was a bulge. This becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge. There was a bulge in the Allies' lines, and the Germans hoped to exploit the bulge in the enemy lines. In this case, they hoped to, sort of like the Battle of Kursk, launch a counteroffensive against that bulge and to seize enough of the enemy, the Allied army, that would be sufficient enough to halt the Allied offensive. It was very much a last-ditch counteroffensive that ultimately fails, and Germany is slowly whittled back. And this is a look at what the German Empire looked like by April of 1945. And it's in that in the early period of 1945 that you see Franklin Delano Roosevelt, shortly after winning election to an unprecedented 4th term as American president, begin critical meetings with Churchill and Stalin that would dictate ultimately the shape of the post-war world. And eventually, after the death of FDR and the emergence of Harry Truman as president of the United States, choices will be made between Churchill, Truman, and Stalin towards the latter phase of the war, and then, of course, after the war, that would sow the seeds for the development of the Cold War. A few more slides, guys. Yalta, 1945. This is Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. When you look at their posture, I mean, obviously, there's some obvious things there. FDR and Churchill, somewhat friends, and also not in military gear. Roosevelt very much played kind of an intermediary with Stalin and Churchill. And Stalin and Churchill really didn't like each other, and Stalin and FDR didn't trust each other. At this conference, though, at Yalta in 1945, FDR sought to work with his allies. And so FDR at this conference made suggestions to Stalin, or at least Stalin took them this way, that the United States, so long as Stalin could help the United States in the war, particularly the war in Asia, FDR implied, or at least Stalin believed FDR implied, that he would overlook attempts by Stalin to occupy areas of Poland and Eastern Europe and, of course, Eastern Germany, which is what, of course, happens at the end of the war. So you see a lot of end-of-the-war decisions being made here. FDR believed that he could negotiate and compromise with Stalin. And Stalin was a rational man, granted a very paranoid person, and also a very brutal leader. But FDR believed you had to work with him, otherwise you're going to have another war, and he wanted to desperately avoid another war, especially on the end of the most devastating war in human history. The Third Reich ultimately collapses in May, officially in May of 1945. And here you see the ruins of the Reichstag, which, if you remember back in February of 1933, it was the fire at the Reichstag that Hitler used to blame an emergency situation on communists, and as a first step to his gaining absolute authority in Germany. And here you see at the end, here you see the Reichstag in almost complete ruins. The Battle of Berlin was the last and final act of war during the Second World War in Europe. It lasted from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. This was the end of an offensive that really began to turn the Germans back after the Battle of Stalingrad, and it was a massively hard-fought and gritty campaign. The Germans, in many cases, resist tremendously. In many cases, the German army included individuals from the Nazi youth and also older draftees, demonstrating the degree to which the German army had been completely overwhelmed by casualties. Ultimately, the city's encircled, and it descends into urban warfare, and was tremendously brutal in this respect. And you can get a feel for just the scale when you look at some of those casualty figures, the scale of these battles during the Second World War, and particularly in this case, the Battle of Berlin. Of course, it's at this time that Hitler will commit suicide, along with his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and of course also many other loyal Nazi aides. This is General Wilhelm Keitel signing the military surrender on May 8th, 1945. And after Hitler's death, briefly, it was Admiral Dönitz who was made the Führer at the very end of the war as a replacement to Hitler after he had died. This is a chart that gives you a basic rundown of many of the deaths from the Second World War. These numbers include, for the United States and the United Kingdom, include the Pacific Theater, and civilian deaths also include Jewish deaths in the Holocaust, as well as, of course, the many non-Jewish individuals who died in the Holocaust. Of course, approximately 11 to 11.5 million people died in the Holocaust, and of those 6 million or so were Jewish, but there were 5 million other peoples: Slavs, Russians, Poles, Gypsies, individuals that were prisoners of war, and so forth. This is a very telling, and these are all approximations, and the numbers are debatable, but they're ballpark accurate, and there's a lot of things that can be that we learn from looking at these numbers. First of all, look at the Soviet Union. 25 million people die in the Soviet Union, and more of them, more than double, were actual civilians rather than military. Comparably, look at Poland. Poland has the vast majority of those killed as well, civilians. And comparably, the United States, the vast majority were military and not civilians. And that was a testament to the degree to which the United States had really escaped the sort of total destruction that the other belligerents had faced. World War II also was a truly world war, and if you go online and you look for national casualties, you will find casualty numbers from countries that you would not expect. Even countries like Thailand, for example, which were involved in the Pacific Theater, had casualties. It was a truly world war, and the scale of loss of human life is absolutely unimaginable. Um, for reasons of time, I note that this presentation has not included, several major theaters of battle in the war, including the major engagements in North Africa, which Erwin Rommel, before he came back to head up the Atlantic Wall, oversaw the conflicts in Italy, and of course those in southeastern Europe, and to some degree also in the Western European theater. Um, but the German, the real defeat of Germany really happens in the East. 80% of total German casualties were suffered on the Eastern Front. This is not to discount the importance of D-Day or the importance of the Allied effort in the West, but it just is to just as Lebensraum, as you note in this last point, just as Lebensraum had dictated that the Germans would go into Russia to create this so-called living space at the expense of Jewish people, Slavic people, Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians, so too was here, where the German defeat was ultimately assured. So, this is a tragic but perhaps fitting irony in the final demise of the Nazi regime, as the Nazis, literally reaped what they had sown. They were driven by an ideology, Lebensraum, to initiate a racial and ideological war without mercy against not just the USSR, but against the USSR, against the so-called Untermenschen, the subhumans that were believed to be the Slavic peoples, the Poles, the Jewish people, and so on, and gypsies and so forth. And ultimately, Nazism was ended with the Red Army conquering Berlin, and Hitler committing suicide. And it was the Allies who agreed to allow the Red Army to take Berlin at the end of the war. And of course, Berlin will be, after its defeat, it will be divided amongst the Allied powers, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets. And it will become a centerpiece in the development of the Cold War in the years following the end of World War II. And of course, Germany will be divided, and Stalin will seek his vengeance on Germany. He will try to increasingly force what will become East Germany to become an area to provide reparations for the Soviet Union, and West Germany will be largely rebuilt and designed to effectively incorporate into the United States-driven sort of capitalist world system. And of course, there's still many remnants of this end in Germany still today, even a unified Germany today, as of course American bases are still located in Germany, symbolizing the aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, guys. So let's have a great week.